It was one of the quietest tragedies to ever unfold in the upper Midwest, and for the better part of 70 years, almost nobody outside a handful of old filing cabinets knew it had happened at all. This is the true story of Hollow Pine Asylum and the 1,200 people who passed through its doors and never left the same way they came in. Our story begins in 1931, in a quiet rural county where the land was flat, the winters were long, and the nearest city was a half-day's drive away on roads that, in the spring thaw, sometimes weren't roads at all so much as suggestions. The county had always been a farming community, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where Sunday meant church and a shared dinner table, and where the biggest news most weeks was whose cow had gotten loose or whose barn needed raising. So when word came that the state was building a new hospital just outside town, a real one, brick and stone, 3 stories, with electric lights in every hallway, it was, for a community that had never had much of anything built just for them, a source of genuine pride. Men from the county worked the construction crews. Local families supplied the lumber and the labor for the outbuildings. By the time Hollow Pine Asylum opened its doors in the fall of 1931, half the county had a hand in building it, and most of them figured it for nothing but a good thing. Jobs, modern medicine, a place that would finally help the folks who'd always been quietly cared for, or quietly hidden, in back bedrooms and attic rooms across the county, for lack of anywhere else for them to go. Among the first staff hired at Hollow Pine was a young surgeon named Augustine Whitlock, fresh out of his residency, ambitious, well-spoken, the kind of man who shook your hand firm and looked you in the eye and made the county commissioners feel like they'd found themselves a real catch for a place this size. Whitlock moved into a modest house just down the road from the asylum grounds with his wife, and within a year he'd become something of a local fixture, the doctor everybody pointed to with a little bit of pride, the one who'd chosen their small county over a city practice because, he said, this was where the real work needed doing. The asylum's first superintendent, a man named Harold Beckwith, had spent the better part of 2 decades working at larger institutions out east before taking the Hollow Pine position. And by most local accounts, he genuinely believed, at least at first, that he was building something good. Beckwith hired local women as ward attendants whenever he could, paid a fair wage by the standards of the time, and made a point in his early years of inviting county families out to the grounds each spring for an open house, where visitors could walk the gardens the patients tended and see for themselves that the place wasn't the kind of grim institution rumor sometimes painted it as. Photographs from one of these open houses, preserved in a county historical society collection, show smiling families posed in front of flower beds, children in their Sunday best, the asylum's brick facade gleaming behind them in the spring sun. Looking at those photographs now, knowing what we know, there's something almost unbearable about how ordinary, how hopeful, the whole scene looks. And for the first few years, daily life at Hollow Pine settled into something that, from the outside, looked almost ordinary. Patients arrived from all across the region, some with what we'd recognize today as genuine, serious mental illness. Others, as the years went on, for reasons that had less to do with any diagnosis and more to do with a county welfare officer's judgment about a family that was struggling, or a young woman whose situation had become, in the language of the time, a problem. Families would bring a relative up the long gravel drive, sign whatever papers the front office handed them, and drive back down that same drive feeling more often than not, a strange mixture of relief and guilt that's hard for us to fully understand now. But that was, for a lot of these families, simply what you did when you'd run out of other options. There was a ward attendant named Clara Doss, hired in 1933, just 2 years after the asylum opened, who worked at Hollow Pine for the better part of 3 decades, and who, in a brief 1991 interview given to a local historian shortly before her death, described those early years with a kind of wistful, complicated honesty. "We thought we were helping," she said, according to the historian's preserved notes. "Most of us did. We weren't doctors, we didn't make the decisions, we just did the work in front of us. And the work in front of us most days was just feeding people and keeping them warm and trying to make their days a little less lonely. It was only later, when you started adding things up, that you understood there was a whole other part of it nobody ever explained to the likes of us." One of those patients was a young woman named Idella Marsh, 19 years old, who came up that gravel drive in the spring of 1938. Idella wasn't from a wealthy family. Her father worked a tenant farm a few counties over. But by all accounts, she'd been a bright, lively girl, quick with a joke, good with her hands, the kind of daughter a mother could be proud of even when times were hard. She'd gotten herself into trouble at 17, the way the old-timers in that county would still put it decades later if you ask them carefully enough, an unplanned pregnancy, a baby given up through a quiet family arrangement, and a county welfare officer who decided, not long after, that Idella represented a risk that needed managing. The commitment papers that brought her to Hollow Pine describe her, in the flat clinical language of the era, as a case of moral delinquency and feeble-mindedness. The intake interview that decided her fate, according to the paperwork that still exists today in a state archive, lasted 22 minutes. Idella settled into the rhythms of the asylum the way most patients did: chores, meals, the long stretches of nothing in between, letters home that grew less frequent as the months wore on. She wrote to her sister sometimes, when the staff allowed it, small notes about the weather and whether the garden out back was producing well that year. In one surviving letter, dated late summer of 1938, she describes, almost cheerfully, having been assigned to help in the asylum's small vegetable garden, and mentions that she'd grown the best tomatoes anyone on her ward had seen all season, and that one of the other women had nicknamed her the farmer because of it. Nothing in those early letters suggested she had any idea what was coming, because what almost nobody outside that institution understood, not Idella, not most of the families driving up that gravel road, not even most of the county that had been so proud to help build the place, was that the state had passed a law a few years before Hollow Pine ever opened. A law that gave institutions like it the authority to perform a surgical procedure on certain patients, permanently, without ever asking their consent. The law called it sterilization. It required, on paper, a hearing before a state board first, a safeguard, supposedly, a chance for a case to be reviewed before anything irreversible happened. In practice, those hearings, when researchers finally went looking at the surviving records decades later, lasted on average under 4 minutes. The patients were almost never present. There was no lawyer in the room speaking for them. And the board approved more than 96 out of every 100 cases that came before it. To understand how a law like that came to exist at all, you have to understand the broader movement that produced it, a movement that in the 1920s and 1930s had genuine, mainstream scientific and political respectability in a way that's deeply uncomfortable to reckon with today. The eugenics movement, as it was called, drew support from prominent universities, well-funded research institutions, and elected officials across the political spectrum, all operating from the conviction that a wide range of social problems, poverty, criminality, what the era termed feeble-mindedness, were primarily hereditary, and that the state therefore had not just the right, but the obligation to prevent certain people from having children. More than 30 states across the country passed compulsory sterilization laws during this period, and the United States Supreme Court itself, in a 1927 decision that has never been formally overturned, upheld the constitutionality of these laws in an 8-1 ruling, with the majority opinion famously declaring that 3 generations of what the court called imbeciles were enough. Hollow Pine's own state passed its compulsory sterilization statute in 1929, 2 years before the asylum even opened its doors, meaning the institution was built, from its very foundation, with the legal authority to perform these procedures already written into the law that governed it. Superintendent Beckwith, in his earliest annual reports to the State Board, preserved today in the same regional archive that holds so much of this history, makes only passing reference to the sterilization program in his first few years, treating it, in his own words, as one tool among several available to the institution in service of the patient's and the public's long-term welfare, a sentence that, like so much of the documentary record from this period, reads now as almost unbearably clinical given what it was actually describing. 11 months after Idella arrived at Hollow Pine, her file shows a single line added by a clerk's hand, a referral to the surgical service, case number 1147, authorized by the Eugenics Board. The hearing connected to that case number lasted 3 minutes. Idella wasn't there for it. No one from her family was there for it. The decision, recorded in full in the board's own minutes, reads simply, "Petition approved. Procedure authorized." 6 weeks later, Dr. Augustine Whitlock, the same well-liked young surgeon the whole county had been so proud of, performed the operation himself. Idella Marsh remained a patient at Hollow Pine for 14 more years after that. She was finally released in 1953 into the custody of a relative, a grown woman by then in her mid-30s, with a file that simply stops there. No further word from the institution. No record of what the rest of her life looked like once she walked back down that same gravel drive she'd come up 15 years before. For a long time, Idella's story might have been the only one anyone could really tell in detail, because most of what happened at Hollow Pine over the following 2 decades happened the same way it happened to her. Quietly, on paper, 3 minutes at a time, with almost nothing surviving in the record beyond a name, a date, and a procedure code in a surgical ledger that, by the time the asylum finally closed in 1961, listed 1,200 entries in total. As the 1940s wore on, Dr. Whitlock's reputation within the institution and within the broader regional medical community only grew. A 1946 profile of him, published in a regional medical journal, written by a colleague at a comparable institution 2 states over, praises him specifically for what the article calls his efficiency, noting, in a passage that researchers studying this period have since quoted as one of the most chilling surviving descriptions of the program, that Whitlock had developed a streamlined surgical protocol allowing Holopine to process, in the article's own word, a higher volume of these procedures per surgical day than any comparable facility in the state. Whitlock, by his own account in a handful of surviving letters, took genuine professional pride in this efficiency, viewing it not as anything troubling but as a mark of medical competence, the same way a surgeon today might take pride in a low complication rate or a fast recovery time. It's worth pausing here on what daily life actually looked like inside Holopine during these years, because the surviving records, fragmentary as they are, do allow for at least a partial picture. The asylum operated 4 residential wards by the early 1940s, segregated by sex and by the institution's own internal classification of patient severity, with the most labor-intensive cases. Patients requiring near constant supervision, housed in what the staff internally referred to as the infirmary ward, a section of the building that, according to Clara Doss's 1991 interview, was perpetually understaffed even by the already low standards of the rest of the institution. Meals were taken communally in a large dining hall, prepared in a kitchen staffed largely by patients themselves as part of what the institution termed occupational therapy, a practice common across asylums of this era, justified at the time as therapeutic and productive, though it also, not incidentally, provided the institution with a significant amount of unpaid labor that kept its operating costs far lower than they otherwise would have been. Patients who were considered well enough and whose labor was needed worked the asylum's own farm, nearly 200 acres of cultivated land that supplied a significant portion of the institution's food, tended almost entirely by patient labor under the supervision of a small number of paid farm staff. Idella Marsh's tomatoes, mentioned in her 1938 letter, were very likely grown as part of this same system. It is a strange and uncomfortable thing to sit with, that the same institution performing involuntary surgery on patients without their consent was, in the very same years, relying on those same patients' uncompensated labor simply to keep its doors open and its kitchen stocked. Not every patient connected to Holopine's surgical history disappeared into the same documentary silence as the 1,100 whose individual files were eventually lost. One case, more thoroughly documented than almost any other because it generated an actual surviving personal account, belongs to a woman named Opal Ferris, committed to Holopine in 1944 at the age of 26. Opal had grown up the youngest of 6 children on a small dairy farm, and by every surviving account from family members interviewed decades later, she'd always been the sharpest of the bunch, the one who finished school fastest, who could do sums in her head faster than her older brothers could on paper, the one everyone assumed, before things went sideways, would end up running the farm's books someday. What brought her to Holopine, according to her commitment record, was a diagnosis of hysteria and nervous instability following what the same record describes only briefly as a period of significant personal distress, a phrase that, according to the same family members interviewed years later, almost certainly referred to the death of Opal's young husband in a farming accident just months into their marriage, a grief that, in the clinical language of 1944, was apparently sufficient grounds for institutional commitment. Opal's case differs from Idella's in one critical respect. She resisted, in writing, in a way that survived. Surviving institutional correspondence, along with a 1944 letter Opal herself managed to send to her sister, a letter that, remarkably, survives today, having been preserved by the sister's own family for decades before eventually being donated to historical researchers, describes Opal's awareness of and explicit objection to her scheduled procedure, written roughly 3 weeks before it was performed. "They say it is decided, and there is nothing for me to say about it," the letter reads. "I have told them I do not consent, and they have told me my consent is not the kind that is needed here." That sentence, "my consent is not the kind that is needed here," has become, in the decades since the letter's rediscovery, one of the most frequently cited individual documents from this entire era of American institutional history, precisely because it captures, in a single line written by the person actually living through it, exactly the legal and moral mechanism that allowed 1,200 procedures to occur at a single institution with only 11 signed consent forms. Opal Ferris underwent her procedure in early 1945, 3 weeks after writing that letter, and remained at Hollow Pine for an additional 9 years, finally discharged in 1954. What happened to Opal in the years immediately after her release is, unusually for this story, fairly well documented, because she gave a brief interview to a county newspaper in 1961, the same year Hollow Pine finally closed, on the occasion of the asylum's closure being announced, though notably, the article itself focuses entirely on the closure as an economic and administrative story, a state consolidating its institutions to save money, and makes no mention whatsoever of the sterilization program, despite Opal having been one of its documented patients. In the interview, Opal speaks only generally about her time at Hollow Pine, describing it as a hard chapter she preferred to leave behind her, and the reporter, by all appearances, never asked further. It would be another 42 years before the state itself would ask the question that 1961 newspaper reporter never thought to. That question finally came in 2003, when, as part of a broader wave of state-level reckonings with eugenics-era sterilization programs happening across the country, the state legislature passed a formal resolution of apology to all individuals sterilized under its compulsory sterilization statute and established a state-funded compensation program for surviving victims. Opal Ferris, by then 91 years old, was one of the program's earliest documented applicants, and one of a small number of Hollow Pine survivors confirmed to have received compensation before her death in 2007, at the age of 95, 63 years after the procedure that had been performed on her, without, in her own words, the kind of consent that mattered. The 2003 compensation program, intended primarily as a gesture of acknowledgement and a modest financial remedy, inadvertently became one of the most significant sources of new information about Hollow Pine specifically. Because the application process required claimants to provide whatever documentation they could of their own institutional history. Documentation that, in a meaningful number of cases, existed only in family possession, never having made it into any official archive at all. Of the roughly 400 individuals statewide who applied before the program's window closed in 2011, 61 identified Hollow Pine specifically as the institution where their procedure occurred. Adding 61 individually documented cases to a historical record that, until that point, had relied almost entirely on the 203 cases connected to surviving institutional files. The compensation program's final 2012 report includes an estimate based on statewide patterns identified across all participating institutions that the actual number of eligible survivors who never applied due to death before the program existed, lack of awareness, or what the report carefully terms the documented reluctance of many survivors to revisit or publicly discuss this period of their institutional history, likely exceeded the number of actual applicants by a significant margin, potentially several times over. Dr. Augustine Whitlock, for his part, never faced a single consequence for any of it. He retired from Hollow Pine in 1957, a year before the state's sterilization law was finally repealed, and he lived another 11 years after that, dying in 1968 as what his hometown newspaper called, in his obituary, a respected physician with decades of dedicated service. The obituary devotes 2 full paragraphs to his contributions to the betterment of the county's medical care, and closes with a quote from a surviving colleague describing him as a man ahead of his time. Nobody in that obituary mentioned the 1,200 names in the surgical log. By then, most of the county that had once been so proud to help build Hollow Pine had mostly stopped thinking about it at all. Superintendent Harold Beckwith, who had presided over the institution's opening and its early hopeful years, retired in 1951, 10 years before the asylum's closure, and lived to see, in his final years, the very beginnings of the national conversation that would eventually unravel the program he'd overseen. A single surviving letter from 1959, written to a former colleague 2 years before his own death, suggests Beckwith had, by the end of his life, developed real misgivings about the institution's history, though the letter is frustratingly vague about specifics. I find myself unable to account, some nights, for how a thing can begin in good faith and end the way ours did, he wrote. I do not know that I have an answer for you, or for myself. The asylum itself closed for good in 1961, swept up in the same broad national wave of institutional consolidation that closed so many large state hospitals across the country during this exact period. Hollow Pine's remaining patients, a population that had dwindled by then to just under 200, transferred to 2 larger regional facilities over the course of several months. 18 years later, in 1979, the buildings themselves were torn down entirely. The land folded back into the kind of quiet, unremarkable farmland it had been before anyone ever broke ground there in 1931. There's one more name worth knowing before we get to what's left of Hollow Pine today, because his story, more than almost any other connected to this institution, captures just how completely an entire community could know something was happening and still, somehow, not really know it at all. His name was Reverend Silas Cobb, and for nearly 20 years, from 1936 until 1955, he served as the asylum's part-time chaplain, splitting his time between Hollow Pine and a small Methodist congregation in town, the same congregation that more than a few of the asylum's own staff, including Clara Doss, attended on Sundays. Cobb's surviving sermon notes, donated to the regional archive by his granddaughter in 2009, offer an unusual window into how a thoughtful, genuinely devout man could spend 2 decades inside an institution like Hollow Pine and still, by every indication in his own writing, never fully reckon with what was happening around him. His notes are full of careful, compassionate language about the patients he ministered to, prayers for their comfort, reflections on their dignity before God, several passages that read, even now, as genuinely tender. And yet his notes make almost no direct mention of the surgical program at all, across nearly 2 decades of writing, except for a single ambiguous passage from 1947 that researchers have puzzled over since its rediscovery. "There is a part of the work here," Cobb wrote, "that I have made my peace with by not asking too closely after its particulars, and I am not certain, examining my own conscience honestly, whether that peace is the kind a man ought to be proud of." That sentence has become, for researchers studying Hollow Pine, almost as significant as Opal Ferris's letter, because it captures something the surgical ledger and the eugenics board minutes never could: the texture of how an entire community, staff included, managed to coexist with this program for nearly 3 decades by simply, deliberately, not looking at it too closely. Cobb continued in his role until 1955, 2 years before Whitlock's own retirement, and according to his granddaughter's account, never spoke about his time at Hollow Pine in any detail for the remaining 20 years of his life, even to his own family. It's worth sitting, too, with what happened to the children born before some of these procedures, or in the rare cases where patients arrived already pregnant, because the asylum's own records show that Hollow Pine maintained, for a period spanning the 1930s and into the early 1940s, a small on-site nursery, housing on average between 4 and 9 infants at any given time, born to patients who had been committed while pregnant, or in a smaller number of documented cases, who had become pregnant during their commitment under circumstances the surviving records never fully explain. These infants were typically removed from their mother's custody within the first year, placed through informal arrangements with local families, or increasingly as the 1930s wore on, through the state's own child welfare system, a practice that meant a number of the same women later subjected to sterilization had, in the years immediately prior, already had a child taken from them by the same institution. The nursery's own log, partially preserved, records 31 infants passing through its care between 1933 and 1941, when the practice was apparently discontinued, though the surviving records don't explain why. I wanted to see what was left for myself. So on a gray morning this past spring, I drove out to that same county, following old county records and a hand-drawn map a local historical society had put together years ago, trying to find anything that might still mark where the asylum once stood. Well, we're out here now, and there's really not much left to see. It's mostly just open field now, soybeans, a fence line. But if you look right over here, past that tree line, that's where the old service road used to run up to the main building. You can still see the outline of it in the grass if the light hits it right, especially after it's rained the way it has this morning. It's strange to stand here and think that this quiet field used to be a place where 1,200 people had something done to them that nobody ever asked them about. I talked to a man at the gas station in town before coming out here, an older fella, and he said his own grandmother used to work in the kitchens here back in the 40s. Never talked about it much, he said, except to say it was hard work and long hours, and that some of the women on her ward she never forgot, even 60 years later. He didn't know about the rest of it. Most people I talked to in town today didn't. Before I found the marker, I stopped in at the County Historical Society, a little storefront building just off the main square that's mostly run by volunteers a few afternoons a week. A woman there, probably in her 70s, pulled out a few folders for me without my even having to ask much. Said they get maybe 1 or 2 people a year now coming through asking about the old asylum, mostly descendants trying to track down a relative's history, occasionally a researcher, and once, she said, a film crew that never ended up finishing whatever they were working on. She showed me a few of the open house photographs we mentioned earlier, the families in their Sunday best, the flower beds. And she said something that stuck with me since. She said, "Folks around here always knew it was there. They just didn't know what there meant, if that makes any sense. It was just the hospital. You didn't think too hard about a hospital." She also mentioned that the Historical Society has, over the years, been contacted a handful of times by family members who'd only recently learned, often through the 2003 compensation program or through researching their own genealogy, that a grandmother or great-aunt had been a hollow pine patient at all. Relatives who, in several cases she described, had been told for decades simply that the woman in question had been away for a while or wasn't well, with no further explanation ever offered, even within the family itself. One woman, she told me, had discovered only in her 50s, going through her late mother's papers, that her own grandmother had spent over a decade at Hollow Pine, and that the family had simply never spoken of it, generation to generation, until the paper trail itself was the only thing left to tell her. There is one marker out here, though, not where the building stood, but a little ways off, near what's now a small public park the county put in a few years back. It's a single block of granite, plain, no names on it, because by the time anyone got around to putting it up, nobody could say for certain who all should be listed. It reads simply, "In memory of those sterilized without consent under state authority, 1931 to 1958. We acknowledge this wrong and the harm it caused. May it never be repeated." I stood there for a while this morning, in the rain, reading that stone over a few times, thinking about Idella's tomatoes and Opal's letter, and a ward attendant named Clara Doss who spent 30 years feeding people and trying to make their days less lonely, without ever being told the whole truth about what else was happening around her. 1,200 people. 11 signed consent forms, 264 individually documented names, out of all of them, that anyone has managed to recover in the decades since. The rest are just a number in a ledger now, the way they were always at risk of becoming, even while they were still alive and walking those same halls. I'll leave you with this. When I first started looking into Hollow Pine, I assumed, the way most people probably would, that something like this must have been some kind of rare, isolated abuse. One bad institution, one bad doctor, an outlier in an otherwise reasonable system. But it turns out, the law that allowed what happened to Idella Marsh and Opal Ferris and 1,198 others wasn't unique to this one county, or even this one state. More than 30 states across the country had laws just like it on the books at one point or another during the 20th century, and the United States Supreme Court itself upheld the constitutionality of those laws in 1927, in a ruling that, as of this telling, has never actually been overturned. Hollow Pine wasn't the exception. It was, in its own quiet way, simply doing exactly what dozens of institutions like it were doing all across the country at the same time, all completely within the law. And maybe that's the part of this story that stayed with me the longest, not just what happened inside that building, but how thoroughly an entire system, an entire era, convinced itself, for the better part of 3 decades, that it didn't need to ask. Thanks so much for watching. If this story moved you the way it moved me, stick around, There are more forgotten stories like this one waiting to be told, and I'd be glad to have you along for the next one.